Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the ancient Maya with Simon Martin. I'm Beatrice Rail, the archaeology editor at Cambridge University Press, and I've had the pleasure to work with Simon on his book, Ancient Maya Politics. As many of you know, it was the winner of this year's Haskin Prize, and it edged out over 600 nominated books for this prize, which is given by the American Association of Publishers Prose Awards. Simon is here today to tell you about his book and answer your questions about it. He will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open the virtual floor to questions. Throughout the webinar, I'd like to invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button that you will find on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And I will read out your questions to Simon. But first, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Simon Martin is Associate Curator and Keeper of the American Section at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. He is a specialist in Maya hieroglyphic writing with a particular interest in history, politics, and religious beliefs of the Classic period. During the academic year 2019 and 20, he was the J.I. Kislik Chair in the History and Cultures of the Early Americas at the Library of Congress. Simon has worked on several sites in Mesoamerica, and he is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and 12 electronic publications. And he is the co-author with Mary Miller of the book that accompanied the exhibition held at the National Gallery in Washington and Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco called Courtly Art of the Ancient Maya. So Simon, over to you. And
Thank you.
Right, and I'm going to start with just a very basic questions. Tell us a bit how you came to write your book, Ancient Maya Politics.
Well, I guess like a lot of these things, it was a long process. I think it sort of started, I even have a date for it. I started it in September of 2010. So it's a long process. And of course, also, like many other people doing these things, it's based on pretty much another 30 years of research. So it was a book that needed writing. What's happened in Maya archaeology is that we've managed to, by and large, decipher the writing system. And that has opened a cornucopia of information about culture and society and religion and worldview and politics. And that was important because it was a very disputed subject. You can tell a lot of things from archaeology, but it's also quite open to different interpretations. So we knew that there were many, many Maya cities, and we knew a little bit about the fact that they had historical inscriptions, that they were identified in particular ways, there were certain kinds of political titles. But it still allowed a big divergence. On one hand, people thought that all of these many, many sites, I mean, hundreds, were gathered into big regional states. So maybe only 5, 6, 7, 8 large kingdoms. On the other hand, a lot of the evidence, both from archaeology and from epigraphy, suggested much more of a decentralized picture, with 100 or more separate kingdoms. So those two points of view were battling at the time that I came into the field, and was just very fortunate that a series of hieroglyphs were coming into our notice, and the question was just how to interpret them. So we're talking now about the early 90s, it was possible to kind of develop a third way, a different interpretation, which was keeping the many, many small kingdoms, but basically exposing the kind of hierarchies between them and the ways in which they were networked together and the ways that those networks changed over time. So that matured as an understanding, built more and more data, of course, always in dialogue with archaeology. And reached a point where there was a book which needed to establish and to explain everything we'd been doing since that time.
Hmm. Could you discuss the nature of Maya political systems and how they just differ from standard narratives on ancient polities and political systems?
Yeah, in anthropology, there was a very strong dogma that came out of a sort of new scientific view of anthropology in the 1950s and 60s, particularly. And that it has this really, really structured formula where there are different types of societies and you can predict how they evolve. And there's kind of tipping points, you know, that there's bands, and then there are tribes, and then there are chiefdoms, and then there are states. And many people will recognize that that's the kind of terminology that we just don't use anymore. But it's that higher level. It's are there tipping points between complex societies, which was the issue, and something that falls outside all of those understandings we already knew historically. And the classic example would be classical Greece, where you have multiple numbers of polis. They're all individual, they're never amalgamated, not until quite late on. And for hundreds of years, they interact, but they do so within a system of hegemonies. And you have Athens, and you have Sparta, and then later on you have Thebes. And they're the heads of hegemonic entities, which are not quite empires because they're not really institutionalized. And that's what we find with the Maya case. Many, many kingdoms, but a very dynamic, shifting series of hierarchies.
Well, that leads to my next question. Can you tell me a little bit about how complexity theory has served you in this project?
Yeah, it's obviously in the writing of all this, I was interested in expanding my way of looking at it, because although I had written about these things, there were problems left to be solved, and I didn't initially have the answers to them. I knew that these kingdoms had developed these hierarchies, but why it was impossible, it seems, for any one kingdom to simply conquer everyone else and set up an empire. And for 600 years, 100 kingdoms are battling and struggling with each other, seem to require some kind of explanation. And the two directions I went into, which were a bit unconventional by anthropological norms, was complexity theory and also some work from political science and international relations. In regard to complexity theory, it was something that interested me a lot because it seemed to reflect a lot of the things that we find in history, where there's a tremendous number of different small parts interacting in ways which are very, very hard to predict. And you can't really predict what the whole is going to be simply by understanding its individual parts. And complexity theory talks about that, particularly these concepts of self-organization and chaos. And I think most people have heard about chaos, and it's become part of our sort of lingua franca of science, but it's very often kind of simplified and not understood correctly. But I got into the original literature of that material and tried to see history and politics in ways in which they're almost like the weather, which of course is where chaos theory originally came from. So many tiny, tiny, tiny interacting parts create a whole that you can no longer predict. You can't say where your anticyclone is going to go for sure beyond 2 or 3 days. So that's very much like history. We have contingency in history. We have these events. We can make sense of the past in the same way as you make sense of past weather, but you can't project it into the future and say, how is the weather going to be next year? Or how is history going to turn out next year? We're constantly surprised. And so within limits, it's not as if every possibility is possible, but those things seem to be connected to me.
And what did you take from political science and international affairs that helped you in your book?
Well, there's a big divide between what we would normally call political anthropology and political science. Political science studies essentially us today, the modern world. And everything about the past is how we got there. How did we get to be who we are today and understand the politics of today? Political anthropology is about looking at people who are not us, people who have different kinds of societies. Well, very much changing now that we have globalization, but it grew out of the idea that there were different kinds of societies across the world, and that includes different time periods, things in the deep past, or something else that political anthropology is interested in. So they have different orientations, and in anthropology, it's not very common, or indeed very popular, to take on ideas from political science. And I felt that that was a missed opportunity, because the kinds of systems that we're looking at in terms of the Maya really require us to look at interactions between polities. And that's not something which political anthropology has much of a tradition at. Whereas political science, and especially international relations, look at that all the time. That's really their meat and drink. So there are ideas, the theoretical ideas, observations, ways of looking at things, which I think we could fruitfully borrow from international relations.
Nice. I'd like to go back a little bit to your work in Maya hieroglyphs. Could you tell us a little bit about how our understanding of the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs evolved and how those changes enabled you to write your book?
Yes, so the glyphs were essentially a mystery. We could understand dates and not much else. And I'm talking really about the 20th century here, from the discovery of Maya writing, its recognition, if you like, in the Victorian period, all the way through to mid-20th century, we had a very, very limited understanding. In 1960, a scholar who actually had formerly worked at the Penn Museum, but at that time was somewhere else, essentially proved that the inscriptions were historical and that there were dynastic kingdoms were producing them. The problem was that none of those glyphs could actually be read in an original language. And there was some work being done in Russia at much the same time, so mid-20th century, which had the kernels, it had the key clues to how to read the writing system. And that was left for 20 or 30 years without being fully exploited until a new generation of scholars came along, some, in my view, extremely smart people, who began to pick the best parts out of that work and expand it, discover new principles, form a much more holistic idea of how the writing system works, and crucially, relating it to Mayan languages, both as they're spoken today and as they were spoken in colonial periods, where we have big dictionaries and lexicons which prove very, very useful. So yeah, as a potted history, that's the simple version.
Could you tell us about your overall methodology, specifically your use of both written sources as well as archaeological evidence?
Yeah, one of the things that we're used to around the world is what we would call historical archaeology, where on one hand we have material remains, on the other hand we have texts. And in fact, what we would used to be called the old world is something that was born out of text. It was something where we had sources about Greece. I mean, we had the Bible talking about Mesopotamia, long before we could read any inscriptions. And that came along a bit later, but together, those two sources were our window into that kind of past. And archaeology came in as to test and to try and prove the things that were in various forms of literature. So in the Americas, it's the complete opposite way around, where archaeology has been the only way of looking at the deep past, and writing, in terms of deciphering Maya hieroglyphs, is a very new thing. So those contrasts have made different kinds of discipline and different kinds of dialogue between the two. And what I was trying to achieve in the book was to bring some of this kind of competition and contestation to an end as being really unnecessary. And there will always be issues about how text and material relate to one another, and we must recognize that. But we are talking about a single past, and both of these sources of data speak to that single past, and ultimately they must be reconciled.
Can you give us a really good example of how the written sources and the archaeological evidence really beautifully came together in a specific, case or problem that you were working on?
Well, I suppose an example would be to look at explosive site growth. We have some places where they were quite minor sites, and then almost overnight they were transformed into big sites, or at least expanding very rapidly, lots of monuments and grand buildings that went up. Now, you can essentially guess or speculate what could have caused that. But with the inscriptions coming along, we could see, for example, the site of Quirigua in Guatemala, which was one of these places which was transformed. They had actually at the same time captured and beheaded their overlords at the much more important site of Copan. So there was a historical incident, a particular day, where that overturned their old relationship and led Quirigua to expand in a much more wealthy and independent way. So that's a good example of the ways in which history and archaeology mesh together.
Nice. Has your work at all been influenced by post-processual or postmodern approaches to archaeology?
All contemporary archaeology and anthropology has to take account of the ways things have changed since the 1960s. And as many people know, things in the 80s in particular changed quite dramatically. Ideas about how secure we could know anything, even about the contemporary world, let alone the deep past. And some of those ideas really unbalanced things and made people skeptical and doubtful about the enterprise of history and anthropology in some ways. But I think actually we can take the best parts of that. For example, the fact that we recognize that scholarship is historically situated. We are not independent thinkers in the way that formerly people believed. We are embedded in our time. We have the zeitgeist flowing through us, and it places limits. It gives opportunities, but it also places limits on what we can even imagine. In 20 and 30 years' time, the world would have changed, and there will be new ways of looking at things that people will use. So I think we have to take account of the critique of the old style way of doing archaeology and anthropology and history, but not perhaps be quite so pessimistic about what we can achieve.
Has your research provided any insight into class differentiation among the Maya?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, people for a long time have recognized that there was very severe class distinction. And in particular, there was a ruling class, and there were commoners and people who were the farmers and the artisans and whatever. And that has both been complicated, enriched, and also clarified by what we know about the text. So we know that there was a kind of ruling caste, a noble caste of which kings came from, and to some extent were only first amongst equals, separated out really from everybody else. At the same time, in archaeological terms, we can see that there isn't a vast economic disparity between these groups. So although there are nobles with titles, there are also commoners who are merchants and priests and architects and military leaders, and that their status in life and their wherewithal economically was comparable in many cases, perhaps even greater than some noble classes, nobles within that class. So it's, again, we've taken something which we could have seen as a very straight division, but a combination of archaeology and text allows us to complicate it, I think, in realistic ways.
Any surprises along the way of your research? Is there something you expected to find or did not find, or?
We're constantly surprised.
Good.
We're very reliant on, I mean, we're realistic. I mean, on one hand, you say there's a cornucopia of data, there's a wealth of material, but it's a very restricted kind of wealth. There's only certain kinds of things that the texts talk about. We don't have economic records, the kinds of things you would have in Mesopotamia, you know, Linear B in Greece and whatever. We just don't have that material. It wasn't something they carved on monuments. They would have written that in books. And the Maya area is subtropical, very humid, and all that stuff survives. So we're reliant on what was carved in stone or bone or painted on ceramic. And we build our histories and our understanding of political dynamics based on a few of those markers. We try and form a narrative from it. At the same time, we know that we haven't got the whole picture, and we are interpolating. We are making certain kinds of assumption in order to understand. But sometimes there's a new event, there's something that's dug out of the ground, something maybe newly deciphered, which shows that we had it wrong. We actually have to revise our opinion. And this comes back to the idea that history is not absolute. It's not, can never be a fixed thing. It is conditional. It depends on the sources that we have. And as those sources change, our histories change, our understanding of the past changes. So we have to be ready for surprises.
How does your book set the stage for future research in Maya civilization?
I'm not sure I'm the person to ask about that. I can say what I hope it does. We have, all fields have a tendency to narrow and become more specialized. It's the nature of an advancing field is that you can't be a jack of all trades. You become more and more focused on your specialty. And I wanted it to go back to look at a wider vision, which was talking to the maximum number of scholars, students, aficionados, and offer some tools, really. Certain kinds of vocabulary, describing certain things that didn't have descriptions before. And through that, really offer these tools that people can use in the future. For example, trying to understand the ways in which multiple polities are interacting. Yes, there are hierarchies, there are hegemonies, but they change while the system itself stays pretty much the same. So I call that a dynamic equilibrium, where the system has a certain kind of consistency, and it doesn't really matter who within that system is the top dog at any one time. That's the dynamic bit, but the equilibrium is the overall system. So I think that it's, in some ways, it's defining things that previously didn't need definition. So there is some ways in which these kingdoms relate to each other, which is not simply competition between antagonistic groups. They are people in the same society. They're in the same culture. And so we have to understand how culture is flowing across boundaries which may be antagonistic. And what is that kind of society that they're making? So I tried to coin a term, the moral order, to understand what are the rules, what are the, it's not a fancy concept. What is the protocols? What is the understandings which they don't necessarily express, except indirectly by the fact that they share so much in the way of culture, and they share a lot of contacts that we have no data about. There was an incident where a monument was found a few years ago, which details a lord from a subordinate lesser polity who travels all the way, hundreds of kilometers from the center, an area we call the Petén, way down into Honduras. And that, threw us for a loop, because we wouldn't have expected that kind of contact over that kind of distance at that kind of level. But of course, in fact, that was going on all the time. It's just we don't normally have data for it. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Great. Well, let's see, I think we gone through all our questions. I can now open the floor to questions. None have come in yet, so here's your opportunity. Those who are participating in this webinar, please, by all means, ask your questions.
Perhaps while they're doing that, I will continue talking about a few of the ways in which I hope the book will make a difference. There's a lot of grey literature. There's a lot of things that glyph experts are saying to each other in emails, or maybe publishing on blogs, but are a long way from ending up in readily accessible print versions. So that's another mission, is to try and take a lot of data that archaeologists and other kinds of specialists won't have had ready access to and simply might not know about. So putting it all together in one relatively bite-sized piece is something that I think tries to serve a purpose, which includes many people's research, not of course all my own. So trying to render that for people is important.
Great. There's still any questions, so if you'd like to keep speaking about any topic of your choice, by all means, do continue.
Well, maybe I could describe the structure of the book and why I put it together in the way that I did. Some years ago, I've been working on this PhD, and there's certain formula to how a PhD is structured. It typically includes introductory chapters with sort of theoretical work, and then data, and then synthesis. And a lot of the time that doesn't quite work in published form. At the same time, as I think that a lot of that process of explanation in detail of what you're doing is important. So this in some ways has a very traditional format. It begins by talking about the history of the field, in particular about politics and about the evolving ideas, how we reach the understandings, and also the disagreements with people proposing other kinds of ideas, and what are the appropriate responses to those things. And then I wanted to talk about political theory in a very broad aspect. So some of the points I've already touched upon. But I also wanted to have another chapter which talked about the nature of text archaeology interactions and what is historical archaeology today, and how can we use text to talk about the past, because in the old days that seems completely unproblematic, and since the post-isms of the 80s and 90s, we have to actually be critical of those things. Well, can we simply believe these inscriptions? A lot of people always felt very, very skeptical that they would be telling us the truth. And but you can attack that issue in various ways, looking at the way the text has relationships to material remains, but also how text relates to each other. So it's important that we have, let's say, 150, the figure is changing all the time, references to specific conflicts. And if people were being continuously and really serious about claiming things fallaciously, then you would expect some of these accounts to differ and contradict each other. But in fact, none of them do. So that's an interesting pointer, that people have shown no sign that they were simply interpreting what was going on in their own way, that there was some level of objectivity.
Okay, we have some questions coming in. And the first one is from Scott Ortman, who asks, I'm curious about the ways in which Maya politics and culture might have played out differently than they do in societies that we are more familiar with.
Yeah, well, yeah, that really hits a point that we deal with a lot. Something that I very often end up saying is that there's a relationship between the world we expect to see in the glyphs as opposed to how it. I've actually slightly kind of lost my track there. Can you just repeat the question so I really feel as if I answer it properly?
I'm curious about ways in which Maya politics and cultures might have played out differently than they do in societies we are more familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, in the old world, what we call the old world, we have to imagine, in fact, we don't have to imagine, we know that contacts were ongoing between all of the civilizations. So even the Roman Empire had very distant connections, say, with China. And we can't see a kind of purity that really all human civilization in the old world is connected. And as far as we've been able to see in the data, that simply isn't true for the New World. That really was a hermetically sealed, as far as we know, development. So to me, it's fascinating that what is it that people in the Americas, the ancient Americas, do, which is the same as what developed in worlds we're more familiar with, and in what ways are they different? Because that tells you perhaps how societies might have turned out in different ways, and this contingency plays a part in that. But also that we have cognitive pathways, we have aspects of our shared humanity which simply express themselves in whatever situation we're in. And that constant dialogue, how are things similar and how are things different, is what makes the ancient Americas so particularly fascinating.
Okay. Are there ways that the classic Maya moral order that you have discussed differs from that which is known about later post-classic groups like the Quiche and the Yucatec Maya?
Wow, yes. Well, I specified that this particular system is the system of the classic period because things did change. As many people know, there was a severe downturn which took place between 800 and 900, and that is the transition between the classic period and the post-classic. What disappeared, apart from a tremendously large percentage of the population, and indeed most or the great majority of major cities were all abandoned. What changed is the end of a kind of quasi-divine kingship. We no longer really use the word divine kingship. Holy or sacralized kind of rulership would be more appropriate. But that's pretty much what disappeared. We think today that the classic period is a special case. It's something where the idea of dynastic government within a single family was preeminent. And that doesn't appear to be true of the pre-classic, so before 150, or indeed after 900. This was a much more varied. Post-classic societies differ in many, many ways. Trade patterns are very different. How people were using the landscape was different. Understanding the collapse is still the big question for those of us who work in the classic period. It is complex. It is operates on many different levels. It's easy to make simplistic assessments of it, but I think now we are continuing to build more data, and that's what we need. Theoretical interpretations have long since reached their limit, unless we can really show in the material and the textual record what was happening. What is that event which led to such a massive depopulation of 90% or more? And that is a fascinating thing. It's what interests me most right now. We have lots of material evidence, and most particularly recently evidence for severe droughts in the past. And they are now emerging as most people's favorites for what could have destabilized society so significantly. But we have been, all of us have been relatively pessimistic, no, I'd say very pessimistic, about what the inscriptions can actually teach us about the collapse. Because what we're losing are the societies that made inscriptions. So as they're snuffed out, the textual corpus gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And also the kinds of inscriptions change. They become shorter and shorter, and they're less material subject matter. But within that data, there is still some very interesting patterns. There's still some interesting leads in what was happening. And I think the full explication of that, together with all the physical archaeological evidence, is the kind of thing we're going to need to solve that problem.
Thank you. That was one of the next questions about your opinions on the reasons for the collapse. Patricia McEnany asks, can you elaborate on what you see as the role of female royals? Why are there so few females who ruled autonomously? How much agency did young princesses who married into foreign courts actually possess? Were they, in essence, running foreign consulates in the courts into which they married?
Yes, Patricia, of course, I know very well. I consider a good friend. Indeed, I mean, I think in terms of the number of absolute ruling queen regnant queens, I think we're missing quite a number. I think that the tendency to not be fully reflective of female rule is there. I think that we even have more coming through than we had previously not recognized, because we're just sort of being more sensitive to the iconography and putting together some eroded text. In regard to female agency, absolutely. I think that one must look at the women who are traveling between different kingdoms as representatives, as people who are engaged in the dialogue that must have been going on between the hometown and the new place. And of course, in almost all cases, there's a power relationship. There's either people coming from weakened, defeated subject kingdoms who are being in some ways incorporated with a more powerful one, or the other way around, where brides from very powerful centers are being sent out to wed together these big Maya hegemonies. So I think that in particular, when we see these sort of queen mothers, these sort of dowager queens who are referred to by their sons when they become kings, they're really talking about some of the power that led them to become king in the first place. I think it's not sentimental that they would give so much attention to their mothers. There are some, and they give a lot of attention to their mothers. And I think they must be seen as the power brokers and the people who, in all likelihood, are singularly responsible for that particular child becoming a ruler. So some of it we can reconstruct, some of it we can see for sure. Much of it we have to accept has been put beneath the surface by the Maya themselves, and we must try and bring it out as well as we can.
Okay, we have another question. This may go a little further back in the political history of your book, but I am interested in your thoughts on how on the Pacific coast, namely the ideas of kingship evident in the iconography during the late formative, and how these relate to the classic lowlands. And also why the glyphic inscriptions are absent from the Pacific coast during the classic period. What does this tell us about how this region articulates with classic Maya politics?
Yeah, another one of the important frontiers of knowledge. We are still struggling to understand the pre-classic stroke formative period. And that is not just temporal, it's also geographic. So we know, for those of you not familiar with it, that many important developments happened on the Pacific coast, and indeed in the highlands of what is today Guatemala. But both of those areas were surprisingly unrepresented in the classic period, for reasons which I don't think anyone has satisfactorily explained. Maybe it's an individual thing, but we don't seem to see anything like the populations, and we certainly don't see the number of monuments or large settlements. In terms of how the formative turns into the classic, that is fundamental to understanding the classic itself. And the sites like Izapa and Takalik Abach are continuing to produce data which is relevant. We have these major pre-classic royal burials emerging at some of these sites, things that weren't necessarily anticipated. So I think that the relationship between the formative and the classic period is certainly more complex than we are often led to believe, or let's say that the sources allow us to infer. I think that we have to go on trying to understand what processes could have led to these kinds of changes. And one of the key things is that since the discovery of the murals at San Bartolo, we know that there's a tremendous continuity, that a lot of the pre-classic ideology, including the ideology of kingship, stayed the same. The classic did not reinvent royalty. It didn't reinvent lordship, and certainly not the whole religious underpinnings of this. This appears to be all in place, and probably goes back to the middle pre-classic, middle formative. So the classic added something, which at the moment seems to be this idea of single family ruling. And that was some sort of motor at that time. But precisely how that worked, what happened to the big pre-classic centers, which were abandoned in a pre-classic collapse that led to the end of sites like Mirador, Nakbay, in the lowlands, are all part of the equation. We're building our knowledge about it, but we're still such a long way from knowing the things we would like to.
Okay. We have a question about relationships. Do you think that there are bigger family relationships between the Adroas and the Calomtes? I hope I'm pronouncing that the right way. As we have here in Europe, where all the royal families are related to each other. The entire Maya area, after all, is not very much bigger than present-day Germany.
Indeed. Well, the term there, the difficult one, was achau. That's the lord title. That's the one which represents this whole noble class or caste even. above that, there is this title Kalomte, which we knew was an important title, but I think we didn't understand how systematic and critical understanding the political geography of the Maya area and how it changes, how important that title was to that. And that's one of the things that the book tries to do, because Kalomte has really never been explored. It's hard to think, I don't think there's a single published article of which that is the only subject. So we need to present a lot of that data. I think that this idea that the kingdoms were deeply networked together is extraordinarily likely. There are some interesting monuments and some things coming back to these kind of surprises. There are, one I can think of in particular comes from the site of Tonina, which is up in the highlands of Chiapas, although it's a full classic site. They have an early altar, which essentially the subject matter is the deaths of rulers from all over the region, including the central Petén, a few hundred kilometers away. And it's hard again to see that this is in any way sort of sentimental, or that this has some practical meaning. There's some reason why they're talking about this. And I think it really can only come from the fact that they are connected genetically, dynastically, with all of these groups. And so therefore these changes are directly relevant to Tonina's relationship with the rest of the Maya world. And I think that's just one of those hints that suggests that, yes, indeed, there's a deep networking on that level. One of the things, again, that the book tries to talk about is the ways in which that might be underrepresented. In the past, we always took a mother of some ruler, that if it wasn't specified that she was foreign, we took it that she was local. And that was a reasonable assumption. But now we know that quite a number, let's say at least some important queens, were foreigners, but they actually never tell us that themselves. And that opens up a much, much wider potential, which is essentially unquantifiable. We can simply say that there are many cases that we don't otherwise know about, but it's now possible to imagine that it's there without direct evidence.
Can you speak of the importance of the ball game? I suppose one place we see the moral order staged today is in international sports. Can the same be said of the ball game for Maya politics? Or might there be a comparison to the function of the ancient Greek Olympics?
Wow, yes. The ball game remains a fascinating social and political artifact, which we separate from the idea of sport. Sometimes we actually, I think, forget that it is a sport, that there may well have been competitions and rivalry, which is not really on some dramatic ritual or political plane, that it was a real sport. But as the question has it, there were certainly these diplomatic and political functions to the kinds of ball games that are represented to us. And in the last 10 years or so, it's become more clear that ball games between local and foreign kingdoms are essentially hierarchical, that the people coming in and playing the game are political overlords. I think that there's so many layers to the ball game. There's ways in which it seems to be related to warfare, ways in which it seems to be related to hunting, that they are both dealing there with a metaphor, and also this real social bonding that would have brought people together. One of the things that fascinates me is just this interaction that was happening, who was traveling between these kingdoms? What kind of knowledge were they bearing? Who was allowed to do that? Was it really a very, very free system, or was it quite circumscribed? And it may be that ball games is one of those sort of official outlets. It's something which represents interaction in ritual, ceremonial, political, but also practical ways.
We have no more questions. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion about your book. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think all the other participants have as well. Thank you so much, Simon.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.